Every day we cross paths with hundreds of people, and most times we don't even remember a single thing about them. I'll go crazy. But sometimes you meet very unsettling people, so unsettling that your memories of them haunt you for a long time, maybe even forever. And you know the look, that smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, the apology that feels rehearsed. The people who lit the fire, watched it burn, and walked away calm, elegant, untouched. We meet them in movies. Hannibal Lecter, charming his way through horror. Tom Ripley, mimicking affection to get close. Anton Sugar, a coin for your life, and flipping coin and meaning it. But sometimes, more often than not, we meet them in real life. The boss who fires people with a smile, the friend who always seems to win no matter who gets hurt, the child who bullies others and doesn't flinch. And we ask ourselves, what is wrong with this person? Psychopathy is what's wrong. It isn't a movie monster. It's a psychological profile, and it's not rare as we'd like to think. About 1 in every 100 people qualifies as a clinical psychopath. That's 80 million people worldwide. That's more than the whole country of Germany. It equals the combined population of California, Texas, and Florida. That doesn't just mean someone who's cold or cruel. It means a person who scores high on traits like chronic lying, shallow emotions, lack of remorse, grandiosity, and calculated manipulation, not in moments of stress, but as a consistent way of being. They don't form bonds or feel guilty the way most people do. They can mimic empathy, but they don't experience it, not really. To them, other people aren't in themselves, they're tools, pawns, leverage, means to get status, control, resources, protection, whatever the game is they're playing it. And it ends up that not caring about others is a good way to get good at the game of life. And they're not always violent. Many don't end up in prison. Some end up in power. Psychopaths often test normally in IQ. Many are socially skilled. In fact, studies show they're more persuasive than average, then often more confident, and sometimes even more likable at first. What they lack is not intelligence. What they lack is empathy. Brain scans show reduced activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, less connectivity with the prefrontal cortex. They see suffering, but they're just unable to connect with it on a personal level. I'll go crazy. And that leads us to the uncomfortable question. If this pattern is so damaging, so cold, so inhuman, why is it still here? Why didn't evolution erase it? If humans are a cooperative species to the core, why preserve a trait so cold, so predatory? Because somehow, for something this dark to survive millions of years, it must have had a purpose, maybe even offered an advantage. So maybe the real question isn't why it exists, Maybe it's why does it seem to thrive in our world today. The definition of psychopathy we've just talked about with traits, it's like superficial or chargeable, and that the shallowest, and a chilling Heidi by Ini was established back in 1990. 19 lack of remorse, an emotionological lying, ini morio self-worth patham grandi. And as Hare described it, these aren't just occasional or recurring behavior, but a very psychological profile, a way of life, you could say. And he found a very fitting name for this, the mask of sanity. At first it seemed like a clinical curiosity, a pattern you'd find in prisons or psychiatric hospitals, because people presenting these profiles could never blend in with the regular people without getting noticed fast right. But as the data came in, a darker possibility took shape. These weren't just broken people. Some were thriving in offices, in politics, in command. And the deeper question started to emerge: why do these traits exist at all? Why would evolution preserve something socially corrosive? When did these traits appear? What caused them? Psychopathy. Psychopathy isn't just a glitch in behavior, and its reality is kind of unsettling. First, it's deeply hereditable, about 50 to 60%, according to studies like the one by Blanagan et al. In 2008. That level of genetic influence is on par with traits like height or IQ, and it shows up early, long before adulthood, sometimes as early as age 7 through what researchers call unemotional traits. But there's no single psychopath gene. Instead, the condition seems to arise from a complex interplay of multiple genes, each influencing emotional regulation, stress response, and social cognition. One of the most studied is Emera, often sensationalized as the warrior gene, a low-activity variant known as male, has been repeatedly linked to increased aggression and impulsivity in males who experienced abuse or trauma in childhood. It doesn't cause violence, but it lowers the emotional brakes that normally stop it. Another candidate is cruelty, a gene involved in dopamine metabolism in the brain's prefrontal cortex. Certain versions of this gene are associated with risk-taking behavior, poor and impulse control, emotional flatness, particularly under stress. There's also the serotonin transporter gene, LSC6A4, which helps regulate mood and emotional sensitivity. A common variant called the short allele has been linked to reduced fear conditioning, lower empathy, and greater impulsivity. Individually, none of these genes make someone psychopathic, but together, and especially in a high-stress or neglectful environment, they can tilt development in that direction. And that brings us to context, because for psychopathy to exist as a stable trait, the environment had to reward it at least at some point in time. And from then on, bringing us to our very roots, between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens entered a new social phase. Groups grew larger and more dynamic. Alliances expanded beyond kin. And the more we trusted each other to survive, the more a few could exploit that trust for personal gain. It also fits into life history theory, which describes how organisms adapt to their reproductive and social behaviors based on environmental pressures. Some humans adopt a slow strategy, empathy, long-term planning, strong family bonds. Psychopathy, by contrast, represents the fastest version of the fast strategy, impulsivity, shallow relationships, opportunistic mating, and low emotional investment. We see this all the way into the brain. 20 analysis of over 40 body itemerised in neuroscience and Blish in Verhati reviews showed that psychopathic individuals consistently dist activity and brains fee in the amygdala, the dysplaty in empathic neuropathy hub. They also show less engagement in the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflict and moral struggle, and weaker connectivity to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which guides emotional decision making and social learning, meaning that they can see pain, but, as mentioned prior, they just don't internalize it. And in volatile environments during periods of scarcity, violence, or social fragmentation, those traits can offer a real advantage. Climate shift times like ice ages are a great example of such situations. The person who doesn't feel guilt can steal. The person who doesn't feel fear can attack. And the one who doesn't form deep emotional bonds can betray without caring about the consequences for the other. Not a good person, not a stable person, but a surviving one. Yes, not common, neither ideal, but effective enough to persist. Psychopathy didn't evolve to help humanity flourish. It evolved to help a few people win when the rules were breaking down. And evolution, after all, doesn't select for harmony. It selects for whatever lives long enough to reproduce or reproduce faster and more often than the rest. Now picture it, if a small human group is traveling through the forest of Europe during the Ice Ages, maybe 30 to 50 individuals. No law, no privacy, no secrets, for long none of these concepts exist yet. Daily life focuses on hunting, sharing, and watching out for each other. In that setting, being cooperative isn't just moral, it's survival. Food must be shared offense, must be avenged to keep the cohesion of the group. Reputation decides survival far more than strength. But now and then, not in every group, someone breaks the script. They smile when others panic. They fake loyalty when the group's in crisis. They step back when danger comes and move in when rewards are handed out. What makes it work isn't brute force or genius. It's timing, deception, emotional detachment. In evolutionary terms, this is what researchers call a low-frequency, high-impact strategy. A 2014 review by evolutionary psychologist Marko Deljudic frames psychopathy as a conditional strategy, one that only functions if it's rare enough to avoid detection, but common enough to persist across generations. Psychopaths in this model are social free riders. They exploit systems they don't contribute to. No contribution equals nothing to lose. And in small-scale societies, that's risky, but not impossible. Anthropological research from groups like Kungan and Ash shows that even in tight-knit hunter-gatherer community Philodi, deceit and reputation-free manipulation occur. They don't always succeed, but when they do, the benefits can be substantial: access to resources as mating partners and political influence. And in modern experimental simulations, the pattern holds. Game theory studies using public goods games show that participants who cheat without remorse or maintaining surface level often outperform others in short terms, while maintaining soul charm gains, especially if they're surrounded by cooperative players. This is exactly how frequency dependence works. The strategy can't scale if everyone cheats. Everything collapses. But if only a few do, they can thrive on the system's blind spots or others. Leniency. Now translate that back 50,000 years in volatile ice age ecologies where survival meant navigating famine, predators, intergroup raids, and shifting alliances. The ability to lie convincingly, to steal without hesitation, or to betray without remorse could offer serious reproductive advantages. As Deljudic notes, these advantages wouldn't be measured in wealth or status, in the most important metric of all good evolutionary strategy offspring. The manipulator doesn't need long-term friends, just short-term success, food, protection, enough to keep their lineage going. And that's what Blanagan's 2008 twin study shows us from another angle. These aren't random behaviors. They're heritable, passed on, not just learned. So when the manipulator survives, their psychology survives too. The tragedy is we rarely see them coming, because in a world built on cooperation, it's easy to mistake charm for loyalty, confidence for leadership, for wisdom. And that's why this strategy doesn't need numbers. It just needs a crowd to disappear into. The archaeological record can't diagnose mental states. It's not like the brain cases of psychopaths are very different from ours. And, as mentioned, context also plays a role in the full blooming of a psycho. But it can show damage. A 2023 study published in Nature, Human Behavior, analyzed thousands of prehistoric skeletons from across Europe and Asia. What it found wasn't the mark of organized warfare, but something more intimate, blunt force, cranial, trauma defensive forearm fractures, stone points, lodged in ribs injuries, delivered at close range one person against another. Not raids, not war, but violence within the group. We'll never know what started those fights, but when the same wounds appear across thousands of bodies, one pattern becomes clear. Some knew how to hurt and get away with it. At Cima de los Osos in Spain, a skull, known as Cranium 17, was found among dozens of other bodies. It belonged to a teenage girl, and it had been struck twice in the forehead, 2 identical blows with the same object. This wasn't an accident, it was a predator. She was killed deliberately, and her body was placed intentionally in a deep vertical shaft. Someone took the time to remove her from sight, but not out of grief. In northern Spain's Evolutionary cave, archaeologists found the remains of 12 Neanderthals, men, women, and children. The bones showed cut marks, signs of butchering, disarticulation, marrow extraction. This wasn't food in an emergency. There were no signs of famine. This was calculated, practiced, controlled. The same thing appears at Moula Cave in France. Human bones dating 100,000 years were processed like animal carcasses, skin, deflaced, cracked for marrow. Again, no clear crisis, just methodical violence. And there's the girl from Janaras in Siberia. She was buried with care beads, ivory tools, finely worked ornaments, but her skull bore the marks of blunt trauma, a crushing blow to the back of the head, sustained while she was still alive. Whatever happened, someone thought to honor her afterward, but not before harming her first. Then there's Bronchial Cave in southern France, 76,000 years ago. Someone, likely Neanderthals, built circular structures deep inside the cave using snapped stalagmites. Blackened bone and fire residue were found inside the structure, required coordination, strength, and deliberate design. They were built in total darkness, far from the cave entrance, whatever was happening there. Survival, it wasn't something else. For survival, it was for something planned. Across sites, across species, across tens of thousands of years, the same traits show up again and again. Violence that isn't chaotic, it's clean, repeated up close. Victims who are younger, weaker, or isolated often. Women or children harm that isn't frantic, but measured. And in many cases, no evidence of remorse, only disposal. This doesn't prove anyone had a clinical disorder, but it raises the question: what kind of person does this? What kind of person can harm like that, not once but repeatedly, with control, and live among others like nothing happened? Psychopathy, as defined by Robert Hare, is not about how often someone acts out, but how they think while they do it. I'll go crazy. It's about charm without feeling guilt, without consequence, a capacity to harm that feels more like calculation than passion. In the archaeological record, though silent, gives us scenes that align disturbingly well. In evolutionary terms, what we're seeing isn't madness, it's strategy. The evolutionary psychologist Marco Delgidicki argued that psychopathy is a conditional adaptation, a response to an environment where coldness, detachment, and social manipulation might actually help an individual survive. Not all the time, not for most, but in some cases, just enough to leave descendants. The people who hurt others in the darkness of Brunel Cave, or dropped a broken body into the shaft at Semeter's hose, or took flesh from someone. They'd have to be con. They once slid beside. They didn't flesh in Lothiman. They just had to survive longer than the ones they hurt. And they did. Not everyone who caused harm was a psychopath, but some were, and some of them, just a few got away with it. They left no testimonials, just fractures and burial silences. They left rituals no one could explain. The past can't tell us who they were, but it can tell us this whatever we call them. Now they've been with us for a very long time, and in the absence of written records or confession, our best chance at understanding ancient behavior comes from the present and our closest points of comparison. Let's look at the Kungan of the Kalahari, desert nomad tribe spanning over Namibia, Botswana, and Angola. They are one of the most egalitarian societies ever studied. Food is shared, boasting is ridiculed, arrogance is mocked. This is not a place where hierarchy thrives so very close to the group cohesion required back in the early Homo sapiens days. And yet, as anthropologist Paulie Weisner observed over years of fieldwork, subtle games still play out beneath the surface. Hunters, especially skilled ones, sometimes minimize their own contributions or publicly downplay others' efforts depending on the social context. A group provider might suddenly act humble or shift attention away from another hunter's success, not of kindness, but to protect or manipulate reputation. Gift-giving, too, can be a performance. Weisner noted that some individuals gave not to meet need, but to bind others an obligation, a form of quiet leverage. Yes, you can also meet this behavior very frequently in prisons, even gossip, which in Kung culture plays a key role in social regulation, becomes a weapon. It doesn't just punish the selfish, it can strategically frame the generous, turning cooperation into a liability. No one would call these people psychopaths, but the behavior's strategic charm, emotional detachment, indirect exploitation look eerily familiar. But they're not alone. It's constant, even over different continents. Take the ash of Paraguay. In ashy society, men hunt meat is shared widely public. Generosity is expected. But anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Herner documented persistent imbalance. Certain high-status males reap far more than reputations, and central conscience essential maintained attribute, and still Fernanda they gave. How through alliances, charisma, and selective visibility, some aligned themselves with productive hunters, some controlled the narrative of who contributed. Most critically, they weren't punished for it. Men, most strictly, they were rewarded. These same individuals had more partners and significantly more children, not because they were fair, but because they knew how to work the system and bypass it. And when social penalties did occur, when freeloaders were confronted or criticized, not everyone paid the same price. The more socially agile often escaped consequences. They played the long game, appearing just generous enough, just helpful enough to keep suspicion away. What we learned from the Kong and the ash is simple and unsettling, even in systems designed fishness. People found giving out forcefully, not opened ways to people find ways without to discourage selfish take by hiding inside the social fabric and pulling at its seams. That's what makes the strategy so durable. It doesn't require a collapse of norms. It just needs enough trust around it to exploit. In the Ice Age, the conditions were perfect, stressful environments, loose group boundaries, alliances, made and broken under pressure. There was space for generosity, and there was space for manipulation. And while most of us descend from the cooperators, some of us descend from those who played a different game. So what happened to the prehistoric psychopath? Like most living beings, they evolved to fit their environment, and as human societies changed, growing more complex, more structured, more hierarchical, the strategy adapted with them. It didn't vanish, it upgraded. In the tribal world, it hid. Small groups surviving on charisma and cold calculation. But when society scaled, so did the opportunities. In ancient Rome, the traits that once helped a hunter hoard food now helped emperors consolidate power. Caligula impulsive, sadistic obsessed with dominance. Nero who burned down his own capital for a better view. Historians like Suetonius and Tacitus described them not just as tyrants, but as emotionally hollow manipulators gifted at performance devoid of empathy. Their cruelty wasn't madness. It was unchallenged power, meeting no internal resistance. As religion rose, the strategy shifted again. In medieval Europe, psychopathy learned to wear robes. Figures like Tomás de Torquemada, head of the Spanish Inquisition, used moral authority as a cover for torture, fear, and control. He didn't act alone, but he designed a system where cruelty was a virtue and suffering could be sanctified. In the age of empires, the world expanded, and so did the reach of the strategy. King Leopold II of Belgium oversaw a brutal colonial regime in the Congo. Up to 10 million people died, hands were cut off as quotas. And back in Brussels, Leopold was praised as a builder of civilization. He rarely visited the colony, he just built the system, outsourced the pain, and collected the profits. Then came the age of ideology. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot, each wrapped their violence in vision. Each rose through systems meant to protect the many, then bent those systems into instruments of mass suffering. Each built mythologies around themselves. Each eliminated guilt inside and out. In the 20th century, psychopathy became industrialized, but even that wasn't the final form. Autocrazy. Today, the strategy thrives in places where the rules are flexible, but the rewards are vast finance, tech, politics, high growth leadership. The same detachment, the same charm, the same strategic coldness that once exploited the trust of a small tribe now thrives in a world of emails, contracts, and profit world of e-margins. Nuns. Modern research shows that psychopathic traits are not randomly distributed in society, they cluster. And today, they tend to rise, especially in places where power accumulates and where consequences can be outsourced. A 2010 study by Paul Babiak, Craig Newman, Robert Hare published in Behavioral Sciences, and the law assessed 203 corporate professionals, nearly 1 in 25, about 4%, met the clinical threshold for psychopathy. That's 4 times the rate found in the general population. They weren't physically violent. They were described by co-workers as charismatic, manipulative, and ruthlessly self-serving. They scored especially high in factor 1 traits of the Hare Sackley checklist: superficial charm, grandiosity, pathological lying, and lack of empathy. Colleagues rated them low on honesty, teamwork, and ethics, but they still rose. Why, God? Because they interviewed well. They could read the room because they said what leadership wanted to hear and didn't care what it cost others. These individuals weren't punished. They were usually promoted. Hiran Babiak called them snakes in suits, psychopaths who had found their niche in the modern institution. And the trend doesn't stop at the Seward, a 2016 meta-analysis by Jonathan and colleagues, published in Personality and Individual Differences, found that people high in the dark triad traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, were significantly more likely to business careers in business, politics, and penal law enforcement. And that's not just career choice, it's survival optimization. In 2017, a paper in Frontiers in Psychology by Smith and Lilienfeld noted that psychopathy may confer contextual advantages in competitive environments, particularly those that reward risk, taking emotional control, and bold decision making. In other words, if the rules protect the charming and punish the emotional, the psychopath has a head start. The same emotional detachment that once allowed a person to steal food from a dying hunter or betray an alliance in the Ice Age now allows someone to cut 10,000 jobs and smile. For the quarterly report is just a small team of execs can be happy with the numbers. They don't sharpen spears anymore. Legal clauses, exit packages, and PR lines are the new weapons. They hunt leverage, and while the rest of us are still running on empathy and fairness tools for building community, they're playing a different game, a game where success means never having to say sorry. Psychopathy didn't vanish, it didn't get mammoths exiled by the tribe. It dives, it moved, caved into the boardroom. And the old predator found a new kind of kill. We want to believe evolution made us better, kind of fairer. More just that over thousands of years, we carved out the monsters and elevated the saints. But evolution doesn't select for kindness, it selects for what works. And sometimes what works is cruelty with a friendly face. Psychopathy isn't a glitch, it's not a broken version of humanity. It's a strategy, one that hides inside the systems built by people who trust each other. It's not the foundation of human culture, but it's the shadow cast by it, because the strategy only works when others assume good intent, when they play by the rules, when they give others the method of the doubt. And psychopaths at their most dangerous don't break the rules. They use them, bend them, rewrite them in ways that serve themselves while appearing legitimate. Psychopathy isn't a path to group survival. It's a loophole in group survival, a behavioral parasite, something rare enough to break the system, but persistent enough to feed off it. Most of us are wired to care, to feel guilt, to cooperate, to protect. That's why we have art and rituals and language and law. But sometimes in every crowd there's someone wired to fake it, not because they failed evolution, because they mastered a darker version of it. They watched the tribe, they learned the rules, and then they used those rules for their own ends, without shame, without fear, without the emotional drag the rest of us carry. We tell ourselves that those people are outliers, anomalies, but they're not. They're rare by design, because if there were too many, the system would collapse. But just a few that's survivable for them The evolutionary psychologist Deljedich called it a conditional strategy, one that doesn't dominate, but infiltrates, one that appears only when the social conditions are right, when the environment rewards boldness over empathy, cunning over community. In the ice, those conditions were scarcity, violence, and tribal fragmentation. Today, their quarterly targets political campaigns, institutional opacity anywhere. Empathy is optional, but performance is mandatory. The predator didn't die in the cave. It adapted, it put on a suit. It learned to network, and it got very, very good at pretending to be just like you. We didn't leave them behind. We scaled the world up and made more room for them and to operate. They're still here, not as anomalies, but as part of the design. And in the system, built systems that reward power, ambition, and results over chaos. We care, sometimes they win. If this story unsettled you or made you see something familiar in an unfamiliar past, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys into deep time, dark minds, and the hidden forces that shaped us. Like the video, if it gave you something to think about, share it. With someone who's ever worked under a boss they couldn't quite explain, and drop a comment. Is psychopathy a flaw in the system, or the system's most efficient feature? Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Your clicks, your thoughts, your voice, they help echo the past into the present. Thanks for being part of the Till Next Time. Keep listening to the echoes.